St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor prided itself on being the sort of village where nothing truly unexpected ever happened. The greatest excitement of any month tended to be Mrs. Prowse's ongoing feud with the milkman or the arrival of a new cake recipe at the Women's Guild. So when the annual midsummer garden fete dawned bright and warm, the villagers congratulated themselves on their good fortune. A perfectly ordinary day, they agreed, just the kind they liked best. Bunting fluttered along the hedgerows, and the green behind the parish hall hummed with cheerful disorder as stalls were arranged, cakes set out, and the brass band tuned with alarming enthusiasm. Children raced about with the particular energy that appears only when an adult is trying to carry something fragile past them. Elderly men, full of opinions and the confidence that came with having voiced them for decades, supervised the erection of tents while contributing nothing beyond commentary. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her second cousin, Mrs. Adelaide Lockwood, for the week, stood near the rose arch, just beyond the green. She held a plate of fairy cakes, which Adelaide insisted must be displayed prominently for the judging, although Miss Marple privately suspected they were too plain to win in a village as competitive as this one. Still, she smiled pleasantly as she watched the bustle. There was nothing she liked more than observing people when they believed no one was watching. "Inspector Harrow's coming today," Adelaide murmured, fussing with the ribbon on her hat. "You know, from the county constabulary. They've asked him to present the Crime Prevention Award again. This is such a pity. He always looks as though he'd rather arrest someone than hand out a certificate." Miss Marple had met Inspector Leonard Harrow only once before, several years ago. He was a brisk, correct sort of man, with the air of someone who memorized the rule book and insisted everyone else do the same. Even in that brief meeting, she had noticed an unusual tension about him. Something coiled beneath the surface, like a watch spring wound too tightly. But here at the fete, with the scent of cut grass and sugared strawberries drifting through the air, it felt almost impossible that anything could disturb the pleasant harmony of village life. Almost. At precisely 2:00, a hush rippled through the crowd as Inspector Harrow mounted the small podium erected near the bandstand. He looked more gaunt than Miss Marple remembered, and the lines around his mouth deeply etched. He held a leather-bound folder in one hand, the award certificate, presumably, and cleared his throat with forced authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is my privilege to—" He stopped. Several people turned to one another, puzzled. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had spent her life noting minute changes in expression, and there was something, not shock, but recognition, in Harrow's fixed stare. His gaze had latched onto someone near the edge of the green, though from the angle she could not see whom. Harrow's lips parted, and for a moment he looked like a man fighting through a sudden, consuming thought. He reached toward his coat pocket, slowly, almost reluctantly. Then, as the sunlight flickered through the elm branches, a low sound escaped him. Not a cry, exactly. More like the beginning of a word he hadn't the breath to finish. He collapsed. The folder fell from his grasp, fluttering open on the wooden boards. A small slip of paper drifted out, an oddly pale rectangle that spun once in the air before settling near the edge of the stage. The crowd froze for a heartbeat. Then pandemonium erupted. Mrs. Prowse screamed. Mr. Tilbury from the butcher's shouted for water, as though that ever solved anything. Several people ran forward, most with good intentions, a few with none at all. Miss Marple did not move. She merely watched, her gaze lingering on that faint scrap of paper by Harrow's hand. Dr. Fenton, who had been judging the jam competition, pushed through the throng and knelt beside the fallen inspector. After a tense moment of examination, he looked up and shook his head. "Dead," he pronounced gravely. "Quite dead." Gasps rippled through the green. A summer breeze lifted the corner of the paper near Harrow's hand, exposing a few words written in a hurried, uneven scrawl. Miss Marple, standing closest, saw them first. "He knows." The fete, once filled with laughter and petty rivalries, descended into stunned, shivering quiet. The brass band, unsure what else to do, stopped mid-tune with an embarrassed clash of cymbals, and Miss Marple, almost imperceptibly, tilted her head. There was something very curious about dying in the middle of a sentence. Curious, too, that a man like Inspector Harrow, rigid, methodical, and not given to emotional flights, should clutch a note that spoke in such ominous terms. Most curious of all was the look she had glimpsed on his face in that final moment. Recognition, and Miss Marple folded her hands together, the faintest shadow of concern warming her otherwise serene expression. St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor was no longer a village untroubled by unpleasantness. A crime had arrived at the garden fête, quiet, efficient, and deeply personal. And Jane Marple, as always, had already begun to notice things. For several seconds after Dr. Fenton's pronouncement, no one moved. Time, which had been proceeding in its usual comfortable way for St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor, seemed to pause politely and look around to see what on earth was happening. Then the murmuring began. Dead? Did he say dead? An attack of the heart, it must be. Told you he was overworked. Never looks well, that man. This will get into the newspapers. You mark my words. The crowd, thwarted in its desire to be useful, was settled instead for being inquisitive. People craned their necks, stood on tiptoe, and shifted just enough to see without being so bold as to get in the way. A few of the bolder children tried to edge closer to the stage, only to be pulled back by scandalized mothers who were nevertheless staring quite avidly themselves. Miss Marple, who had moved forward just enough to be within easy earshot, watched Dr. Fenton as he rose to his feet and brushed off his knees with unnecessary briskness. The doctor was a big, ruddy-faced man with thinning hair and an earnest manner. He disliked drama, which made him particularly ill-suited to moments such as these. "Someone fetch the police," he said, though in fact the police, Inspector Harrow, lay motionless at his feet. The local constable, Appleby, and we must clear the green. And there's nothing to be done for him now. Mrs. Prowse, who always considered herself the guardian of village propriety, clapped her hands sharply as though dispersing a flock of unruly hens. "You heard Dr. Fenton. Back, all of you. Give the poor man some dignity, at least." This was an unfortunate choice of words, as it instantly spun off into a flurry of anxious whispers. Dignity, such a sudden death. And at the fate, oh, it's dreadful, dreadful. Do you suppose poison or something? One woman murmured to another, who responded at once. Don't be ridiculous, Mabel, although she looked quite thrilled at the idea. Miss Marple had gently stooped under cover of the confusion and with a slight tremor in her fingers, whether from age or from the faint excitement of the moment, and not even she could have said, picked up the small slip of paper that had fallen near Inspector Harrow's hand. She did not, as one might suppose, immediately attempt to secrete it away or declaim over it. That would have been theatrical, and Miss Marple disliked theatricals except on the proper stage. Instead, she smoothed it carefully between her fingers and regarded it with mild curiosity. The words were few and hastily written. He knows. No address, no signature, no context. The handwriting was untidy, with an impatient slant, as if the writer had been angry or very hurried, or both. The paper itself was from an ordinary notepad, the type one might keep by the telephone or beside an untidy desk. "Jane," Adelaide hissed at her elbow, "for goodness' sake, what are you doing up there? Come away, people will talk." "They are already talking, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, folding the note once, then twice. "I have merely joined the majority in being inquisitive." Dr. Fenton turned and seemed to notice her for the first time, though she had been standing there all along. His expression softened in automatic politeness. "Miss Marple, is it? Best you step back, ma'am. We don't yet know exactly. Well, it isn't a pleasant sight." Miss Marple's blue eyes, very clear in her lined face, rested on Inspector Harrow's body. There was no sign of external injury, no struggle, no drama, only a slight twisting of the features and the peculiar stillness that arrives when a living thing ceases to live. She had seen death before. She knew it in all its ordinary and extraordinary forms. "Of course, Doctor," she said. "I shall go at once. And only, I believe this fell from his hand." She held out the folded note. Dr. Fenton took it, glanced at it, and frowned. His brows drew together in an expression of discomfort rather than comprehension. "Oh, yes. Well," he cleared his throat. "Probably nothing of importance. A personal matter. We'll leave it for the authorities to decide." But he slipped the note into his pocket with an alacrity that Miss Marple did not fail to notice. "Quite right," she said mildly. "I'm sure the authorities will be very interested in it." As she and Adelaide moved back into the crowd, the first distant sound of a bicycle bell drifted across the green, followed by the clatter of hurried wheels on gravel. Constable Appleby arrived winded, red-faced, and wearing an expression of mixed horror and self-importance. Moments later, so he was striding about with the air of a man who wished to convey that he had been expecting a corpse at the garden fete all along. Now then, he puffed. "Everyone back from the stage, if you please. No more gawping. This is an official matter." "Appleby looks like a boiled beetroot," Adelaide muttered. "Honestly, the way these men behave, he'll be giving orders to the vicar next." He very nearly did. The Reverend Mr. Duncombe, a mild man who had been on the point of opening the fete with a prayer about community spirit, found himself instead offering Appleby the use of the vestry to telephone the county station. Gossip, like a particularly virulent plant, had already taken root. "I heard he was investigating something rather nasty in the county," said Mrs. Perry, the postmistress's wife, and in an undertone that carried beautifully. "Crooked solicitors, or smuggling, or possibly a murder. When a man dies like that, it is never just the heart, you know." "Well, my cousin in Much Waverden says," began another woman, only to be interrupted by Mr. Tilbury, who declared with authority that sudden deaths in policemen were always suspicious. He offered this as a general principle of life, like the unreliability of foreign cheese or the moral decline of the younger generation. Miss Marple listened, apparently only half attentive, her hands folded loosely on the handle of her umbrella. In reality, she was sorting the remarks into little mental compartments. People betrayed more of themselves when they speculated about others. That had always been her experience. Certain remarks seemed to her more revealing than others. Mrs. Carter, one for example, the school mistress with iron-grey hair and an almost moral devotion to punctuality, had said quietly, "He looked as though he saw something just before he fell. I was watching him. It was as if he recognized someone and didn't like what he saw." That agreed very precisely with Miss Marple's own impression. Then there was Mr. Edwin Blackstone, the solicitor newly settled in the village, who had drifted out from behind the bookstore with a thoughtful air. He was a neat, self-contained man of about 50, with a careful moustache and a way of speaking that suggested he weighed his words before allowing them out. "Stress," he said with quiet certainty, when asked what he thought. "Police work is very trying. Perhaps he'd been working on something difficult. A conscience can carry quite a weight, and if one allows it." It was a curious remark. Miss Marple put it alongside the others. Constable Appleby, having telephoned for assistance from the county, bustled back to the green with a sense of purpose. He had erected a makeshift cordon around the stage by the simple expedient of telling everyone not to cross it. Dr. Fenton remained nearby, alternately watching Harrow's body and polishing his spectacles. "Appleby," Miss Marple said gently, as he passed near her, "you'll be wanting to know what he said just before." Appleby blinked. He had not, in fact, been thinking of anything of the sort, being occupied with the problem of how one moved a dead inspector without seeming disrespectful. "Well, yes, Miss Marple, if you noticed anything in particular, that is." "He did not say anything," Miss Marple replied. door, and that was what struck me. He started to speak and then stopped. He looked not surprised, but rather as though he had finally confirmed something. It is a very different expression, you know. Surprise is all widening of the eyes and mouth. This was quite the opposite, a sort of closing in. Appleby stared at her for a moment as though she had begun discussing embroidery at a funeral. "Right," he said at last. "I shall, make a note of that." There was, Miss Marple knew, something in the male mind that instinctively dismissed the observations of elderly ladies as harmless, but irrelevant. It had been a considerable advantage to her over the years. She smiled pleasantly. "And Inspector Harrow was looking at someone," she added. "Over there." She gestured, not directly, but with the vaguest motion of her hand toward the cluster of stalls near the elm tree. Appleby followed the general direction. There stood several people: Mrs. Carter, the schoolmistress, Mr. Blackstone, the solicitor, a young man in a smart, slightly flashy suit whom Miss Marple did not recognize, and a dark-haired woman of perhaps 30, pretty in a pale, strained sort of way, who had arrived late and attracted some attention by doing so. "Anyone in particular, Miss Marple?" Appleby asked. "Oh, no," said Miss Marple serenely. "Not in the least. I'm sure it was merely someone he knew. We all look at people we know, do we not?" But she watched his gaze settle on the unfamiliar faces and saw how his posture changed slightly. Constable Appleby, she understood, was beginning to think in terms of suspects, though he would not yet have admitted it to himself. Later, when the county police arrived and the fete was formally declared at an end, people drifted away from the green in uneasy clusters. The bunting still fluttered, but now it seemed oddly incongruous, like laughter in the wrong part of a play. Adelaide, on their walk back to the house, maintained a steady flow of commentary. "It's a scandal, Jane, that's what it is. Dropping down dead in the middle of the crime prevention award. Oh, I dare say it's not his fault, poor man, but the symbolism of it. You can be sure the parish council will make something of that. And did you see Mrs. Perry? Positively reveling in it. She'll be impossible at the post office for weeks." Miss Marple listened and nodded at appropriate intervals. Her thoughts, however, were not on Mrs. Perry or on the parish council. They were on an inspector who looked like a man who had just had his worst suspicion confirmed, and on a note that read, "He knows." People did not write such things lightly. Nor did they die, moments later, without some link between the two. In St. Mary Mead, she had once known a bank clerk who quietly took his own life after receiving a particular letter. Everyone had said it had been overwork, but Jane Marple had suspected otherwise, and events had later proved her right. There were patterns to these things: murder, suicide, sudden death. Human beings followed familiar paths even when they believed themselves unique. As they turned into Adelaide's neat little garden, with its regimented rows of roses and the faint scent of lavender clinging to the air, Miss Marple paused by the gate and looked back toward the green. From this distance, it looked innocent again, just bunting and tents and a bandstand. But somewhere in that tidy, respectable village, someone had written a desperate little note. Someone had reason to fear what Inspector Harrow knew, or believed he knew. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime among gossip and secrets and the small cruelties of village life, felt the first unmistakable stirrings of a pattern beneath the charming surface of St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor. The evening settled over St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor with an unusual heaviness, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Even the sparrows seemed quieter, hopping about the hedgerows with a subdued restlessness that mirrored the mood of the residents. In Adelaide Lockwood's cosy sitting room, the lamps had been lit early, their soft glow casting warm shapes on the wallpaper. Miss Marple sat near the window with her knitting, though she had made very little progress. Her needles clicked in a gentle rhythm that suggested thought rather than productivity. Adelaide bustled in with a tray of tea, rattling slightly as she set it down. She was not naturally a nervous woman, but the events of the fete had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. "I can't think how I'm supposed to sleep tonight," she said, pouring the tea with a distracted hand. "A man dying right in front of us, and Inspector Harrow, of all people. It doesn't seem real." Miss Marple accepted her cup with a small nod. "Things rarely seem real at first, my dear, but they are real all the same." Adelaide let out a sigh and collapsed into the armchair opposite. "I suppose the county police will be all over the place tomorrow. And Constable Appleby, poor man, he looked as though he'd aged 10 years in an afternoon." "He did appear rather flustered," Miss Marple agreed softly. Her eyes drifted toward the window. The street outside was quiet, but she had noticed several residents stepping out from their houses under the pretense of checking on their flowers or shutting their gates. People always grew restless after a sudden death. It stirred old fears, old memories. She picked up her knitting again, but her fingers paused in mid-stitch. "Adelaide," she said thoughtfully, "did you notice anyone speaking to Inspector Harrow before he went up on the stage?" Adelaide blinked. "Speaking to him? No, I don't believe I did. He arrived just after the brass band finished tuning. I remember because Mr. Prowse accidentally blew into his tuba at the wrong moment and nearly startled the vicar to death. Harrow came alone." "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Miss Marple said mildly. "It is only that people do not usually bring notes like that with them to a fete. Someone must have given it to him, or he must have found it, perhaps even just moments before." "The note," Adelaide breathed, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh, Jane, it's really quite dreadful." "Do you think it means something? Truly means something?" "I believe it was meant to mean something," Miss Marple replied. "Whether it meant what Inspector Harrow believed it to mean, that is another question entirely." A light tap sounded at the front door. Adelaide started so abruptly that her teaspoon clattered to the floor. "Who on earth, at this hour?" she whispered, and as though the visitor might be a ghost rather than a human being. Miss Marple rose, calm as ever, and crossed to the door. When she opened it, she found Constable Appleby standing on the step, hat in hand, looking apologetic and damp from the mist that had begun to settle over the village. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he said. "Mrs. Lockwood." "I'm awful sorry to disturb you, but Inspector Graves from the county arrived not half an hour ago, and he's wanting statements from those who were nearest the stage when Harrow fell." "Of course, Constable," Miss Marple said gently. "We quite understand. Would you like to come in?" "Oh, no, ma'am, I mustn't. Inspector Graves is waiting at the hall, and he's a man who doesn't like delays." Appleby swallowed nervously. "If you could walk with me, just for a moment." "You, Miss Marple, they want the witnesses separate-like, so accounts don't get muddled." Adelaide insisted on fetching Miss Marple's shawl, and within minutes the elder woman was stepping out into the cool, dew-touched air. Appleby walked briskly beside her, though not so briskly that she had trouble keeping up. Every few yards he darted an uneasy glance her way. "I wanted to say, ma'am," he began awkwardly, "about what you mentioned earlier, about Harrow looking at someone. Inspector Graves asked me that very thing, whether Harrow seemed to notice anyone in the crowd." "Oh," Miss Marple said. "And what did you tell him?" "I said what you said," Appleby admitted, "that Harrow looked at the row of stalls by the elm tree. That maybe he recognized someone. But Inspector Graves, well, he wants something clearer, something definite. He's not keen on impressions." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Impressions, Constable, are often what lead one to the truth." Appleby looked doubtful but respectful. They reached the parish hall sooner than Miss Marple expected. Light glowed from within, and voices murmured in low tones. As she stepped inside, she saw Inspector Graves standing near the front table. A tall, stiff-backed man with a clipped mustache and an air of decided impatience. He greeted her politely but without warmth. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." She did so, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Constable Appleby tells me you had an unobstructed view of Inspector Harrow's collapse," Graves began. "I'd like to hear your account." Miss Marple described the event simply, without embellishment. She detailed Harrow's arrival on stage, his sudden pause, the unfinished sentence, the expression so peculiar and so distinct that crossed his features before he fell. Graves tapped his pen against the table. "And you are quite certain that he looked toward the stalls? Toward a particular group of individuals?" "Quite certain," Miss Marple said gently, "though I could not say which person precisely caught his eye." Graves leaned back, exhaling. "We've spoken to several of the villagers already. A few mentioned seeing a stranger, young fellow, well-dressed, claims he was passing through but won't say where from. And Mrs. Carter reported that Inspector Harrow met with someone privately last week, though she didn't know who." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted just a fraction. "How curious," she murmured. "Curious or not, it tells us one thing," Graves said, snapping his notebook shut. "That Inspector Harrow was expecting trouble, and someone in this village knew exactly what that trouble was." Miss Marple rose slowly. The mist outside had thickened, turning the lamplight into hazy halos. She paused at the threshold. "Inspector Graves," she said softly, "sometimes what we expect blinds us to what we already know. And Inspector Harrow, I think, had only just recognized someone he had overlooked." Graves frowned, uncertain whether he agreed or not. Miss Marple stepped into the silvered night, her shawl tight around her shoulders. As Appleby walked her back, she said very little. She did not need to. Her mind was already weaving quiet threads together, the note, the glance, the stranger, the solicitor's peculiar remark about conscience, Mrs. Carter's observation about recognition. A pattern was forming, and patterns, Miss Marple knew, always led somewhere, usually somewhere no one wished to look. The next morning arrived with a pale, uncertain sunlight, the sort that filtered through thin clouds as though reluctant to commit itself to either brightness or gloom. It suited the mood of St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor perfectly. The village awoke early, not from eagerness, but from a restless unease that had settled like fine dust overnight. Curtains twitched, doors opened sooner than usual, and everywhere people stepped out with the same excuse, just taking the air, while their eyes scanned the street for any sign of official movement. Miss Marple emerged from Adelaide's guest room promptly at 7:30, as she always did. Adelaide was already at the breakfast table, though she had barely touched her toast. "Jane," she said in a half-whisper, as though the walls themselves might gossip, "Inspector Graves has been up since dawn. Mrs. Perry saw him marching down the lane with that dreadful determined stride of his, and Mr. Prowse said he was asking about Harrow's lodging at the inn. Imagine, policemen questioning policemen." Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, tasting it before replying. "It is quite sensible, my dear. When one wishes to know a man's last movements, it is best to begin where he slept." "I suppose. Still, it feels so strange. What do you think he was working on? The inspector, I mean." Miss Marple considered. Inspector Harrow was not a careless man. Whatever troubled him yesterday was something he believed important. Men of his temperament do not grow alarmed without cause. Before Adelaide could respond, so there came another knock at the front door, firmer this time, with the authority of someone who expected to be admitted quickly. Adelaide nearly upset the marmalade in her haste. "Oh, it will be Constable Appleby again, or the inspector. Jane, I swear this house has never seen such traffic." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and went to answer. As she opened the door, she found herself facing Mr. Edwin Blackstone, the village solicitor. He stood with his hat in hand, his expression carefully arranged into one of solemn courtesy. "Miss Marple," he said with a slight bow, "forgive the intrusion. Mrs. Lockwood, I hoped I might speak with you both for just a moment." Adelaide blinked at him. "At this hour?" I assure you, madam, I would not disturb you without reason. He hesitated only slightly before adding, As Inspector Graves has asked to speak with me later this morning. Before I do so, I thought it prudent to clarify a small matter. Miss Marple gestured him inside, watching him with polite interest. She had noticed the man's calm demeanor the previous afternoon. But now, there was a faint tension about him, as though the previous day's events had unsettled the smooth surface of his composure. Blackstone declined tea but accepted a seat. He folded his hands neatly. You were standing not far from me yesterday, Miss Marple, near enough that you might have seen something I did not. Possibly, Miss Marple said, though I cannot promise. He offered a thin smile. Of course, it is merely that Inspector Graves seems very determined to uncover some hidden motive behind Inspector Harrow's presence at the fete. Yet I can think of no reason that Harrow would have been investigating anyone here. He was not a man who took up inquiries lightly. Adelaide interjected, You sound as though you knew him well, Mr. Blackstone. Blackstone paused just long enough for the silence to feel meaningful. We were acquainted professionally some years ago. In London. Miss Marple looked up, her knitting lying still in her lap. Ah, then perhaps his glance in your direction yesterday was not merely random. The solicitor's eyes flickered before steadying again. I'd wondered that myself, Miss Marple, though I assure you I have nothing to conceal. I merely wished to know whether you observed any acknowledgement from Harrow's expression, any hint that he sought to speak with me. He appeared to recognize someone, Miss Marple answered gently. But whom, as I cannot say with certainty. Blackstone's jaw tightened, ever so slightly. I see. Well, I appreciate your candor. He rose, smoothing his jacket. I shall prepare for my discussion with Inspector Graves. Good morning to you both. When the door closed behind him, Adelaide let out a gust of breath. Well, he looked positively rattled, if you ask me. Do you suppose he's hiding something? Many people hide things, Adelaide, Miss Marple said mildly. Though most are quite ordinary secrets. What interests me is what they choose not to say. She resumed her seat, picking up her knitting once more. But she had completed only a few stitches when another tapping sounded. Lighter this time, hesitant rather than official. Adelaide groaned. Good heavens, Jane. Yes, we should install a revolving door. Miss Marple opened it to find the young woman she had noticed at the fete, the dark-haired one with the pale, strained complexion. Today she looked even more anxious, her hands clasped tightly together. Miss Marple, she said in a soft, tremulous voice. I'm sorry to trouble you. My name is Clara Henshaw. They said you were staying here. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Yes, my dear. Won't you come in? Clara stepped inside, but remained just within the doorway, as though unsure whether she had the right to be there. I don't know who else to speak to, she said, her voice quivering. The police, Inspector Graves. He interrogated me for nearly half an hour already this morning. He thinks I knew Inspector Harrow. And did you? Miss Marple asked, and her tone light enough to invite truth rather than fear. Clara swallowed. Only slightly. He had asked to see me last week. He said it was about my brother. Adelaide gasped. Miss Marple kept her expression soft and still. Your brother? Clara nodded miserably. My brother Daniel disappeared 18 months ago. People said he ran off, but I never believed it. Inspector Harrow was the only one who ever suggested something might have happened to him, something deliberate. Miss Marple's knitting fell silent once again. Clara twisted her hands. Inspector Harrow told me he had discovered something that might explain why Daniel vanished. He didn't say what it was. He only arranged to meet me again, yesterday morning, before the fete. Her voice broke. He never arrived. The room seemed to tighten around them, and Miss Marple stepped closer. My dear, did Inspector Harrow give you any indication of whom he suspected? Clara hesitated. Only that Daniel's disappearance was connected to someone in this village. Someone respectable. Someone no one would ever imagine. Did he mention a note? Miss Marple asked quietly. Or that he expected danger? Clara shook her head. No, but he looked afraid, as though he had just realized something terrible. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's arm. Thank you, Clara. You've been very brave to speak of this. Clara blinked through rising tears. Inspector Graves won't listen. He thinks I'm inventing things, but I know Inspector Harrow meant to tell me something important, and now he's dead. Does that not mean something? It means, Miss Marple said softly, saying that whatever he had discovered may now put someone else in danger. Clara stared at her, frightened but hopeful. You think so too? Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her voice deepened with certainty. My dear, I think Inspector Harrow recognized his killer yesterday, and I believe the reason lies with your brother. Outside, the faint tolling of the church bell drifted through the air. The village was waking fully now, walking toward its ordinary routines, unaware that the ground beneath those routines was shifting. Clara's breath trembled. Then, what should I do? Miss Marple reached for her gloves. First, my dear, you must tell me everything your brother was involved in before he disappeared. And then, she added, her eyes bright with quiet resolve, as we shall have a little conversation with someone Inspector Harrow also meant to see, though they may not know it yet. The investigation, Miss Marple knew, was no longer merely about a sudden death at a garden fete. It had begun to unearth a secret someone had worked very hard to bury. Clara sat very still after Miss Marple's request, her fingers twisting the edge of her handkerchief until it formed a crumpled white cord. Adelaide brought her tea. Too much milk, too little strength, but the girl accepted it with a grateful, distracted nod. Miss Marple gave her a moment to gather herself, aware that too much prompting could scatter a frightened mind rather than focus it. It began, Clara whispered, with Daniel's new position at the solicitor's office. Not Mr. Blackstone's, oh no. Daniel wasn't nearly experienced enough for that, but at a small firm just outside the village. He was always clever with numbers, even as a boy. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, though she already suspected that the mention of numbers, of accounts, would lead somewhere significant. Disappearance rarely sprang from nothing. There were always threads trailing somewhere. At first he was so proud, Clara went on. He said he'd finally found work worth doing, but then, about 3 months before he vanished, he changed. He grew nervous, kept checking over his shoulder, shutting his door when he wrote letters. He even locked his desk, which he never used to do. Mother noticed too. And did he speak about what troubled him? Miss Marple asked gently. Clara shook her head. Only once, and he told me that people in the village were not always what they seemed. That sometimes, he phrased it oddly, sometimes good manners and good reputations were the best camouflage a person could have. I didn't understand him then. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Many people do not understand the meaning of a warning until it is too late. Clara swallowed hard. One evening I went into his room to fetch a book, and I saw him hiding something in the lining of his suitcase. A small envelope, thin but stiff as though it had a wooden card or something flat inside. When he saw me, he turned white. Truly white, Miss Marple. He said it was evidence. Adelaide gasped. Miss Marple didn't, although the word evidence slid into place with a soft, inevitable click. What kind of evidence? She asked quietly. I don't know, Clara murmured. He said it was safer if I didn't. That he would explain everything soon, once he'd spoken to someone he trusted. 1 week later, he was gone. For a brief moment, the room held nothing but the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple felt the steady tick like a heartbeat, one that belonged to the story itself, pulsing toward a truth that did not want to be found. Adelaide leaned forward, eyes wide. But surely the police searched his things. They did, Clara whispered. The envelope was gone. Miss Marple took a slow breath. Then either your brother retrieved it before he disappeared, or someone else did. Clara nodded miserably. That's what Inspector Harrow believed. He said this was the part he emphasized again and again, that Daniel discovered something about someone here, in St. Aldwyn on the moor, someone who'd managed to conceal it for years. Did he name that someone? Miss Marple asked. No, but Inspector Harrow intended to. He wrote me a letter saying he had made a breakthrough. He wanted to meet me yesterday morning. I waited for him outside the inn for over an hour. Miss Marple murmured, knitting her fingers together instead of the wool she had abandoned on her chair. People rarely miss appointments when they have something important to reveal, unless someone else intervenes. A tremor passed through Clara. You think he was stopped? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that someone knew he was about to speak, and that person was present at the fete. Clara's breath caught. And Daniel, do you think he was? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Truth required delicacy, and sometimes mercy needed to walk beside it. I think, she said at last, that your brother discovered a very dangerous truth. And I think Inspector Harrow, by uncovering the same truth, brought that danger upon himself. Clara bowed her head. Adelaide slipped an arm around her, the gesture clumsy but heartfelt. A soft knock at the door startled all three women. Adelaide rose immediately. Her house had not seen such traffic in years, and opened it to reveal Constable Appleby once more, looking as though the weight of the entire village sat upon his shoulders. Miss Marple, he said, his gaze flicking uneasily to Clara. The inspector wants to see you again. There's been a development. What sort of development? Miss Marple asked. Appleby tugged at his collar. The postmaster brought in Harrow's belongings from the inn. Inspector Graves went through them and found a scrap of paper tucked in his diary. Names, or rather, initials. Initials, Adelaide echoed. Appleby nodded. 3 sets. One of them, well, Inspector Graves thinks one might be linked to a missing person file Harrow kept. He wasn't pleased. Says it suggests Harrow was running an unofficial investigation. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. May I ask what the initials were? Appleby swallowed. D.H., C.H., and E.B. Clara stiffened violently. D.H., Daniel Henshaw. And C.H., Miss Marple asked gently. Me, Clara whispered. My name. And the last, Miss Marple finished softly. Edwin Blackstone. Appleby nodded miserably. Inspector Graves is with him now. Things are getting tense. Miss Marple stood, adjusting her shawl with calm, precise movements. Constable, I please inform Inspector Graves that I shall join him at once. Appleby hesitated. Miss Marple, between us, do you think the solicitor's mixed up in something? Only it would be a rare thing for Harrow to put a man's initials in his diary, otherwise. That depends, Miss Marple replied, on whether the initials were meant to accuse or to protect. Appleby blinked. Protect? Why would Harrow protect her? Miss Marple was already stepping past him, Clara and Adelaide watching anxiously from the doorway. Constable, she said kindly, people often place their trust in the wrong direction. It is not unusual at all, but sometimes the gravest mistake is one of omission. Someone Inspector Harrow failed to suspect until the very last moment, and when he finally understood, it was too late. She walked down the path with serene purpose, even though her mind was moving swiftly. If Edwin Blackstone had been connected to Daniel, that connection alone did not prove guilt, and Clara's initials being there could mean she was involved only as someone Daniel confided in. But Harrow had looked toward the stalls. Toward the solicitor, yes, but also toward someone else entirely. Someone whose presence had passed as unremarkable, whose reputation shielded them more effectively than any disguise. Someone whose face, in Harrow's final second, had revealed more than they intended. Miss Marple felt the faintest ripple of certainty. She had not yet solved the puzzle, but one piece had just clicked into place. Inspector Graves was waiting near the vestry when Miss Marple arrived, pacing in short, clipped steps that suggested both annoyance and strain. His mustache bristled in a way that indicated he had not slept well, and Constable Appleby lingered nearby with the guilty air of someone who had been scolded before he could defend himself. Through the frosted glass of the vestry's interior door, a shadow moved, steady, composed. Edwin Blackstone was still inside. "Miss Marple," Graves said sharply, though not rudely. "I've just finished questioning Mr. Blackstone, a most unproductive conversation." "I imagine Mr. Blackstone is not a man easily flustered," Miss Marple replied gently. Graves snorted. "Flustered? No. But evasive? Absolutely. And now this business with Harrow's diary, initials without explanation. I do not appreciate puzzles inserted into official records." Miss Marple folded her gloves. "Some puzzles are meant as safeguards, Inspector. Others are warnings." He gave her a scrutiny that was almost irritation. "Do you believe Harrow meant to warn someone?" "I believe," she said softly, "that he meant to record what mattered most urgently to him, but urgency clouds clarity. A dying man's priorities are rarely written in tidy lines." Before Graves could reply, the vestry door opened and Edwin Blackstone emerged. His composure was intact, though the careful smoothness of it was beginning to strain at the edges. He paused when he saw Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," he said with a courteous nod. "Constable Appleby, Inspector Graves has been most thorough." There was a faint dryness in the last word. Graves stiffened. Blackstone continued, "It appears Inspector Harrow kept more extensive notes on village residents than I was aware. Including your brother, is Miss Henshaw." His gaze flicked toward Clara, who had insisted on accompanying Miss Marple but stayed a few steps behind. Clara swallowed. "Did you know Daniel, Mr. Blackstone?" He hesitated, too slightly for most, but not for Miss Marple. "I knew of him," he replied. "Not well. Clerks in small firms come and go." Miss Marple's head tilted the slightest fraction. "Yet you worked in London during that period, Mr. Blackstone. Your involvement with local firms was minimal." Blackstone's eyes flickered, again, too briefly for most. He recovered quickly. "You have been well informed." "Village life," Miss Marple murmured. Graves cleared his throat impatiently. "Mr. Blackstone, you are not to leave the village for the time being. I may have further questions." Blackstone met that order with a polite nod, but something behind his eyes tightened. Resentment, perhaps, or something closer to fear. Then he walked past them and out into the misty morning. Constable Appleby watched him go. "He doesn't look pleased." "No guilty man ever does when told to stay put," Graves muttered. Miss Marple's soft reply followed him like a breath. "Nor does any innocent man who feels wrongly suspected." Graves huffed and turned back toward her. "Now then, Miss Marple, you said something earlier, something about Harrow recognizing someone. I want that clarified." She folded her hands neatly. Inspector Harrow looked toward the stalls with an expression of realization. A realization often comes from seeing something, or someone, unexpected. Someone one did not anticipate being present. "And," Graves pressed. "And," Miss Marple continued, "it was not Mr. Blackstone he was surprised to see?" Graves blinked. "Not Blackstone?" "No." Clara stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Then who?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped inside the vestry as Graves opened the door. The room was plain, smelling faintly of hymnals and damp stone. On the table lay a few of Harrow's personal belongings, a watch, a fountain pen, a small notebook, and the torn scrap of paper containing the initials. She picked up the notebook gently. "May I?" she asked. Graves nodded. I've examined it already. Nothing but appointments, travel notes, and those initials on the last page. Miss Marple skimmed the entries with quick, discerning eyes. Ah, she murmured. I see. You do? Graves demanded. Because I certainly do not. She closed the notebook with a soft snap. Inspector Harrow meant to meet Clara yesterday morning, did he not? Yes, Clara whispered. At the inn. And later, Miss Marple continued, he intended to confront someone at the fete. That much is clear. Graves shook his head. Clear. Harrow left us nothing explicit. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, he left quite a detailed record, only he did not know he had done so. Graves stared. Miss Marple, forgive me, but unless you explain yourself plainly. But before she could answer, rapid footsteps sounded outside. The door burst open and Mrs. Prowse rushed in, red-faced and breathless. Oh, Constable Appleby. Inspector, it's awful, simply awful. You must come at once. Appleby jumped. What's happened now? Mrs. Prowse clutched her shawl dramatically. It's Mrs. Carter, the schoolmistress. No, the gardener found her collapsed behind the church hall, stone cold, and the doctor says she's been dead for hours. Clara gasped. Graves swore under his breath. Miss Marple, however, blinked only once. Mrs. Carter, the quiet, disciplined woman who had said, quite calmly, that Inspector Harrow had looked as though he recognized someone he didn't like seeing. Where is she? Graves barked. Behind the hall, Mrs. Prowse wailed. Oh, it's terrible. 2 deaths in 2 days, and they say she had a bruise right here on her temple. Graves was already sweeping past her, Appleby scrambling to keep up. Clara looked at Miss Marple in horror. Do you think someone killed her? Because of Daniel? Because of what she might have known? Miss Marple rested a steadying hand on the girl's arm. Mrs. Carter was a perceptive woman. She noticed things, and those who notice things can sometimes see what others wish hidden. Then she was silenced, Clara whispered. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she began walking toward the church hall, her steps unhurried but certain. Come, my dear, she said. We must not speculate. But Mrs. Carter, I think, saw something yesterday that she did not fully understand. Clara followed, trembling. What did she see? Miss Marple's voice was calm, but beneath its surface lay a quiet gravity. Not what she believed, she said, but someone she knew, someone she trusted, behaving in a way that made no sense unless she happened to witness something incriminating. And now she's dead, Clara whispered. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, which means the killer is growing desperate. Inspector Harrow recognized him. Carter saw him, and now he fears being seen again. Clara clutched her throat. But who? Who could it be? Miss Marple's eyes drifted across the misty graveyard toward the hall, where Graves and Appleby knelt beside a still, sorrowful figure on the ground. Her gaze lingered on the neat hedge nearby, the path of footprints, the slight disturbance in the gravel. Then she looked back toward the village street, the direction from which Mr. Blackstone had left, composed yet uneasy. And then, past that, further still, to the house whose windows reflected nothing but calm respectability. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, the person we seek is not hiding in shadows. He is hiding in plain sight. She walked on, leaving that quiet truth hanging in the cold morning air. And the small crowd that had gathered behind the church hall stood in a stunned semicircle, their murmured speculations held at bay only by Inspector Graves's stern look and Appleby's frantic gestures of authority. Mrs. Carter lay half-hidden beside a hedgerow, her grey hair neat as ever, her spectacles crooked only because they had slipped during her fall. Dr. Fenton crouched beside her with an expression of weary disbelief. 2 unexpected deaths in 2 days had shaken even his medical composure. Miss Marple approached quietly, Clara close beside her, though the younger woman hung back when she saw the lifeless figure. Miss Marple moved a little closer, not touching anything, but looking with the keen, unobtrusive gaze of someone who had seen far too many tragedies to be startled by a new one. "She's been dead most of the night, Doctor," Fenton said grimly without being asked. "Likely struck from behind. A single blow. Precise, not frantic." "Frantic blows are the province of passion, Doctor," Miss Marple murmured. "But precision usually belongs to fear." Inspector Graves straightened at that. "Fear? Fear of what Mrs. Carter might reveal," Miss Marple said, "or already had revealed." Graves narrowed his eyes. "You said yesterday she made an observation, the expression Harrow wore before he collapsed." "Yes. And I believe she realized something else later, something she intended to share." "With whom?" Graves demanded. "I don't yet know," Miss Marple replied. "Perhaps she herself did not realize until last night. Recognition takes time to settle." Clara, pale and silent, whispered. "She was killed because she saw something. Something about Daniel, or about Inspector Harrow." Miss Marple touched the girl's hand comfortingly. "Mrs. Carter may not have understood the significance of what she saw, but someone feared she might." Graves rubbed his brow. "So we now have 2 deaths tied to Harrow's mysterious investigation, and 1 missing man, Daniel Henshaw, potentially at the center." He looked toward the village with a troubled expression. "I need to question Blackstone again. Twice in Harrow's diary, and now Mrs. Carter dead after looking unsettled when she mentioned him yesterday. It's too much to dismiss." Miss Marple neither agreed nor disagreed. "Mr. Blackstone is certainly connected, but connection is not proof of guilt. There were others near those stalls yesterday." Clara looked anxiously at her. "Then whom do you suspect?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Tell me, Clara dear, did your brother ever mention visiting anyone here in the village? Anyone besides his employer or his family?" Clara frowned in thought. "Only once. He said he'd spoken to someone who asked a great many questions, but he didn't say who." Miss Marple nodded slightly, filing that away. Graves seemed impatient, but unwilling to interrupt. Appleby, who had been circling the perimeter with earnest determination, returned, wiping his forehead. "Inspector, there's footprints leading along the side path. Light ones, but fresh. Someone came this way late last night." "From the village?" Graves asked sharply. Appleby nodded. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes drifting along the disturbed gravel. "Yes. Someone walked here. Someone accustomed to being unnoticed. Soft shoes, narrow heel, not a man with heavy boots." Graves raised an eyebrow. "A woman? Possibly. Or simply someone light in build. Either way, they approached from the main lane." She pointed delicately. "A direction, Inspector, that is far more revealing than it seems." Clara inhaled sharply. "The lanes near the schoolhouse. Mrs. Carter would have walked that way often." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And someone followed her." Graves' jaw tightened. "If Blackstone—" "I would not leap so quickly, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, Mrs. Carter was a schoolmistress of strong principles. If she realized something troubling, she might have gone first to someone she trusted implicitly." Clara looked confused. But who could she trust more than the police?" "Someone in her daily life," Miss Marple said. "Someone who shared her routines, her moral certainties. Someone she believed incapable of wrongdoing." A shadow passed over Clara's face. "You don't mean someone she knew well?" "Someone she knew too well to suspect," Miss Marple corrected softly. Graves looked impatient. "Names, Miss Marple. If you know something, say it plainly." "I know nothing for certain yet," she said, though her tone carried quiet conviction. "But I can see a pattern forming. Inspector Harrow recognized someone yesterday. Mrs. Carter recognized that same person later, and that person, fearing exposure, acted swiftly. "Black stone," Graves said immediately. Miss Marple did not share his haste. "Mr. Blackstone has secrets, yes, but secrets are not the same as guilt." Clara tugged gently at Miss Marple's sleeve. "Then who? There were so many at the fete. Who could frighten a police inspector and silence a schoolmistress?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "My dear, people are not frightened by strangers. They are frightened by those who know their weaknesses, and Mrs. Carter saw something very small, but very unnatural." Graves bristled. "Such as?" "A gesture," Miss Marple said. "A look, a reaction that made no sense, unless one already knew it was significant." Her voice fell to a thoughtful murmur. "Inspector Harrow looked toward the stalls, yes, but not at Mr. Blackstone." His eyes shifted past him, to someone he recognized from his past work, someone whose presence at the fete was unexpected. Clara's breath caught. Unexpected. Like the young man in the fancy suit. He seemed out of place. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but fear rarely looks toward the unfamiliar. It looks toward what we know too well." Graves clenched his fists. "So what are you suggesting?" Miss Marple took a slow breath. "I'm suggesting, Inspector, that the killer is not the newcomer in the village, nor the man with a dubious past, nor the anxious solicitor with secrets of his own." She looked toward the village street, toward the rows of neat houses, each with curtains drawn in quiet propriety. She spoke so softly that only Clara, standing nearest, heard the first part. "The killer," she said, "is someone whose life intersects with this village at its most ordinary points." Then, more firmly, "Someone who blends into the very fabric of the place." Clara's eyes widened. "Someone respected." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. Deeply respected." Graves frowned deeply. "Who?" Miss Marple turned her head very slightly, watching the wind stir the hedges. "Before I name anyone," she said gently, "there is one more thing we must find. A missing piece. Something Daniel concealed. Something Inspector Harrow sought to recover." Clara whispered. "The envelope." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The envelope hidden in Daniel's suitcase, and later removed." Graves stiffened. "You think the killer has it?" "I think," Miss Marple corrected, "that the killer believes he does." She began walking away from the hall, her steps measured, her expression calm but intent. "Come, Inspector," she said. "The truth of Daniel Henshaw's disappearance is close at hand, and when we uncover it, the murderer of both Inspector Harrow and Mrs. Carter will no longer be able to hide, whether in plain sight or otherwise." Graves hurried after her, Clara close behind. Miss Marple did not look back. She did not need to. The next move belonged to the killer, and Miss Marple knew exactly where he would make it. Inspector Graves kept pace with Miss Marple as she crossed the churchyard, though his stride was shorter than usual, tempered by the sense that he was following a line of reasoning he could not yet see. Clara walked slightly behind, her breaths shallow, her face pale with shock and determination. The morning mist was lifting, revealing the rooftops and chimney pots of St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor in soft, blurred outline, as though the village itself were trying to retreat behind a veil. Miss Marple paused near the lich gate, her eyes drifting toward the narrow street leading away from the green. "Inspector," she said quietly, "the killer has acted twice in as many days, once in public, once in near darkness. That tells us something important." Graves exhaled sharply. "That he's desperate, cornered." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "But more than that, he's not accustomed to improvisation. His methods reveal calculation, but not panic, not yet. Both deaths were neat, swift. He used opportunity, not force." Clara shuddered. "He must be watching, waiting to see how much we discover." "Most certainly," Miss Marple murmured, "and waiting to retrieve something he believes is still hidden." Graves frowned. This envelope Clara mentioned. The one Daniel hid. Why would the killer believe it still exists? Because, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Inspector Harrow did not confront him sooner. Harrow's caution would have suggested one thing above all, that he had not yet secured the evidence. The killer must assume it remains where Daniel first concealed it. She turned toward Clara with a soft smile. My dear, do you recall anything else about that envelope? Its size, its thickness? Clara frowned in concentration. It was small, flat, but stiff somehow, like it held something hard. Not paper exactly. Something that would not burn easily, Miss Marple murmured. Something that could survive damp or hiding. Graves scratched his chin. A photograph? A key? A calling card? Miss Marple shook her head. Not a photograph. Too flexible. A calling card would not be stiff enough to matter. As for a key, Daniel would not have hidden a key alone. It would need context. Clara hesitated. He once mentioned markings. Said they frightened him. He said the truth about a person could fit in the palm of your hand. Miss Marple's eyes warmed with sudden understanding. Ah, yes, that would do it. Graves looked exasperated. Would you kindly enlighten the rest of us? But Miss Marple only offered him a patient smile. In time, Inspector. For now, we must focus on what the killer believes. He is certain the envelope still lies somewhere connected to Daniel. Somewhere Daniel might return to. Clara's breath caught. His old room? Yes, Miss Marple said. Or more likely, a place he trusted more than his room. Somewhere the killer knows Daniel favored. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The shed. She looked from Miss Marple to Graves with sudden urgency. Daniel used to keep things there. Letters, tools, secrets. I'd forgotten because after he disappeared, Mother locked it up. Then that, Miss Marple said, is where our killer will go next. Graves turned instantly. Appleby, we're heading to the Henshaw property at once. But Miss Marple lifted a gentle hand. Inspector, if you approach with police at your back, he will see you coming from streets away. He will flee or worse, act again. Graves stopped, vexed. So what do you propose we do? Sit and wait while he slips through our fingers? No, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but resonant with certainty. We must give him what he expects. Clara blinked at her. What does he expect? Miss Marple turned fully toward her, her expression softening. He expects the household to remain unsettled, distracted, still reeling from Inspector Harrow's death. He expects Mrs. Henshaw to be home, high unaware of danger, and he expects access, unobserved access, to the shed. But if he finds it occupied, if someone is already there? Clara gasped. You mean me? Graves looked positively alarmed. Miss Marple, I cannot permit— No, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently. Clara must not be alone. But she may accompany me. The killer will not anticipate an elderly woman and a grieving sister quietly tending to old memories. And you intend to confront him? Graves demanded. No, Miss Marple replied. I intend to observe him. The confrontation must come later. First, we must see what he tries to retrieve. And how? Graves paced, clearly torn between professional caution and the strange, inexplicable faith Miss Marple seemed to inspire in everyone else. Very well, he said finally. But I want Appleby posted down the street. I'll circle around the lane myself. The moment you feel endangered— Miss Marple smiled. I have lived many years, Inspector, and in that time I've learned that danger rarely arrives when one expects it. It arrives when one is distracted. Clara nodded, though fear trembled in her posture. If this helps find Daniel, I'll go. 10 minutes later, the three of them, Miss Marple, Clara, and Graves, trailing at a distance, walked toward the Henshaw cottage. The lane was quiet. Even the birds seemed subdued by the thick, watchful silence that had settled over the village. Miss Marple felt the weight of many unseen eyes, some curious, some anxious, one or two perhaps afraid for very different reasons. Clara unlocked the cottage door with trembling fingers, and Miss Marple stepped inside with her usual serene composure. The cottage smelled faintly of lavender furniture polish and old letters. Clara led her through the back door toward a narrow garden path where the shed stood, half lost beneath a creeping mass of honeysuckle. The shed door, as Clara had said, was locked. She reached inside a flower pot for the hidden key. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her wrist. "Now, my dear, we take care. Open it slowly. Look first, step second." Clara nodded anxiously and eased the door open. The interior was dim, filled with the scent of old wood, dust, and the faintest trace of oil from forgotten tools. Miss Marple entered first. The shed was exactly as a young man might have left it. Scattered notebooks, a broken stool, a small wooden crate, but her eyes immediately found what the killer would be looking for. A loose floorboard, slightly raised, discreet, but not invisible. Clara gasped softly. That wasn't like that before. "No," Miss Marple said. "It was lifted and replaced." She knelt, her fingers brushing the cool wood. "He has been here once already, but he found nothing, which means Daniel hid the envelope somewhere else after all." Clara's breath trembled. "Then he'll come back." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Very soon." Footsteps sounded outside, too deliberate for the wind, too soft for graves. Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression calm and knowing. "He's here," Clara whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "And now we shall see what he does when he believes he is unobserved." The shed door creaked, a quiet, careful movement. Miss Marple folded her hands. The killer had come. The shed door eased inward with an agonizing slowness, stopping just wide enough to admit a silhouette, cautious, angled, listening. Clara's breath hitched beside Miss Marple, but the elder woman placed a steadying hand upon her arm without looking away from the doorway. She stood precisely where the faintest streak of daylight from the high window could halo her figure, while Clara remained partially hidden behind the old crate. Miss Marple's calm voice broke the silence before the intruder could step fully inside. "Do take care not to stumble," she said softly. "Sheds can be treacherous when one enters in haste." There was a sharp intake of breath, a sound of shock, quickly masked. The figure straightened, then stepped forward, the light falling across his features. It was not Edwin Blackstone, it was Dr. Fenton. Clara let out a tiny, strangled sound, and Dr. Fenton flinched at it. So his usually ruddy face was pale beneath the bristle of his graying hair, and his hands, strong, competent hands, were clenched into fists at his sides. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a strained sort of smile, "you startled me. What are you doing here? This is private property." Miss Marple regarded him with perfectly polite surprise. "Indeed it is, and one might say the same to you. I should have thought a man of your professional standing would hesitate before entering another person's outbuilding uninvited." Dr. Fenton took a step backward. "I came to check something. Mrs. Henshaw asked me—" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "She did not." The doctor's throat moved in a visible swallow. Clara's trembling became near audible, and Miss Marple gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Come in fully, Doctor," Miss Marple continued. "No need to linger in the doorway. After all, you have been here before." His expression twisted, just briefly, into something raw. Then the careful facade returned. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," he said sharply, "but this is absurd. I demand you step aside." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "No, I don't believe you do, because you must realize, Doctor, that your presence here, after Mrs. Carter's unfortunate death, raises rather serious questions." At the mention of Mrs. Carter, he flinched as though struck. "Her death was an accident," he said too quickly. "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, her tone as light as if discussing weather. "It was murder, a precise blow, you said yourself, delivered by someone who knew exactly how to incapacitate without mess." "I'm a doctor, Miss Marple," Fenton snapped. "My knowledge is hardly criminal." "Knowledge is neutral," she agreed. "Its use is not." Clara, mustering her courage, stepped out from behind the crate. "You killed her," she whispered. "You killed Inspector Harrow because of Daniel." Fenton's eyes widened, not with guilt, but with something like despair. "Clara, no, you don't understand. I never wanted—" He broke off, his breath catching. Miss Marple watched him with compassion, not condemnation. "Dr. Fenton," she said softly, "why don't you tell us what Daniel discovered?" Fenton pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead. There was nothing to discover, nothing criminal at least. He was mistaken. Clara cried. "He was frightened. He hid evidence." Fenton's jaw clenched. He believed he'd found irregularities in medical records, old ones, and he thought they implicated someone in forging patient signatures to obtain controlled medications, painkillers, sedatives. He thought it was me. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Was it you?" His silence answered the question, but Miss Marple did not accuse him. She merely observed. "You were a respected doctor in the village long before Daniel was born. If you had made such errors or misjudgments or committed small deceptions, perhaps to help a patient who could not pay or to spare someone humiliation, such acts might have followed you into later years." Fenton's shoulders slumped. "You don't understand. I wasn't selling anything. I wasn't profiting. I was trying to help someone, years ago, a woman in pain. No one believed her illness at the time. No one but me." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Compassion can lead us into complicated territory." "But Daniel," Fenton whispered, "saw only the falsified entries. He thought I had stolen drugs, that I was dangerous. He threatened to expose me." "And you confronted him," Miss Marple said. Fenton shook his head violently. "No, I begged him to listen, but he ran. I never saw him again. I thought he'd left the village." His voice cracked. "I thought, truly, that he had gone somewhere safe." Clara's face had gone white. "You mean you don't know what happened to him?" Fenton stared at her, and in that moment, Miss Marple saw the truth. Whatever else he had done, he had not harmed Daniel. "No," he whispered. "I don't know. I never knew." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And Inspector Harrow?" she asked softly. Fenton closed his eyes. "He confronted me last week. Well, he found Daniel's notes and believed the same. Thought I'd been stealing drugs or misusing my position. I told him he was wrong, that the forged signatures were from years ago, but he wouldn't believe me. He said he'd dig deeper, that he'd expose everything." "So you feared he'd cost you your practice," Clara said bitterly. Fenton's eyes snapped open. "I didn't kill him, I swear it." Miss Marple watched him closely. His fear was real, his desperation genuine, but not the desperation of a murderer. His emotions moved in the wrong directions, peaked at the wrong moments. They told a different story entirely. "No," she said softly. "You're not the killer." Fenton stared at her, speechless. Clara looked stunned. "But he came here. He followed Mrs. Carter. No," Miss Marple repeated gently. "He came here because he thought the envelope would clear his name. He followed Mrs. Carter because she had seen something and he feared she believed the worst of him. He hoped to beg her not to accuse him." Fenton sank to a crate, burying his hands in his face. "I came last night to search for the envelope, but I left when I couldn't find it. I didn't hurt anyone. I only wanted—" Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on his shoulder. "To protect your reputation." He nodded helplessly. Clara looked torn between confusion and relief. Then who did it? Who killed Inspector Harrow? Who killed Mrs. Carter? Miss Marple turned slowly toward the shed door. Someone who feared exposure far more than Dr. Fenton ever did, she said softly. Someone whose respectable reputation was built on deception, not compassion. Someone Daniel uncovered. Someone who realized Inspector Harrow had made the same discovery. She paused. And someone, she added gently, who knew Mrs. Carter walked home alone each night, past the very place where Harrow was meant to meet Clara. From outside came a soft scuff of gravel, too deliberate to be wind, too cautious to be innocent. Clara gasped. Fenton froze. Miss Marple's voice lowered to a whisper. He is here. And as the shadow darkened the doorway, Miss Marple finally spoke the name of the killer. The shadow crossed the shed's threshold with a stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the figure wished to enter without disturbing a single mote of dust. Miss Marple did not flinch, nor did she raise her voice. She merely turned her head, so her calm blue eyes lifting to meet the face now emerging into the faint morning light. "Mr. Tilbury," she said softly. The butcher stood framed in the doorway, his broad frame filling it entirely. His apron was gone, replaced by a dark coat, but the posture, slightly hunched as though concealing bulk, was unmistakable. His expression was curiously blank, but his eyes, small and quick like a terrier's, darted to Clara, to Fenton, to the loosened floorboard, then to Miss Marple. "I wondered," he said after a moment, "how long it would take you." Clara recoiled with a soft cry. Fenton stiffened, then sagged with sudden clarity, as though understanding everything far too late. Miss Marple alone remained perfectly serene. "I knew the moment I remembered Mrs. Carter's words," she said. "She mentioned seeing someone behave strangely, someone whose presence Harrow noticed with great surprise. Someone he recognized. Unexpectedly." Tilbury snorted. "Unexpected? I was standing right there at the cake stall. Everyone knows me." "That," Miss Marple said gently, "was rather the point. Inspector Harrow did not expect you to be at the fete, because he recognized you from a different context entirely. Not as a butcher from St. Aldwyn, but as a man involved in something quite unsavory many years ago." Tilbury's face hardened. "He didn't know anything. He guessed." "No," Miss Marple corrected. "He remembered. When you turned your head toward him, the angle of your jaw, the scar beneath your ear, quite faded now, but distinctive, stirred his memory. You were not always Mr. Tilbury the butcher. You were once Mr. Atkins, and an accomplice in a smuggling affair Harrow investigated in Dorset 5 years ago. He never proved your involvement, but he knew your face." Tilbury's jaw twitched. Clara pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. "And when Daniel," Miss Marple continued, "discovered inconsistencies in the medical records of one of your victims, records you forged to obtain specialized sedatives for the smuggling ring, he became a threat." Tilbury's eyes slid to Fenton with cold amusement. "And you thought it was you he was after?" Fenton stared at him, horrified. "But Daniel didn't know what he'd uncovered," Miss Marple said quietly. "He thought the forged medical forms pointed to a doctor misusing medication. He never realized the beneficiary was not Dr. Fenton, but you, a butcher with access to transport, storage, and a network of men who trusted you implicitly." Tilbury stepped into the shed, closing the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click. The space shrank around them. Miss Marple did not move. "Daniel came to confront you, or perhaps only to ask questions. You panicked, you threatened him, and when he fled—" "He tripped," Tilbury said sharply. "I didn't push him, I swear I didn't. He stumbled on that blasted ditch near the mill stream, hit his head on the stone. One moment he was alive, shouting his mouth off, and the next—" His voice cracked, though not with remorse, merely with the memory of fright. Clara let out a strangled sob. "Daniel, my brother, is dead." Tilbury's expression did not soften. I didn't mean it. But what was I to do then? You think I'd let myself be ruined over a stupid accident? Over a boy who didn't understand what he'd found? So you hid him, Miss Marple said gently. There is an abandoned culvert near the stream, a place a desperate man would choose. Tilbury's eyes flicked toward her with something like grudging respect. You're clever, Miss Marple. I'll give you that. Clara swayed on her feet, and Miss Marple shifted slightly, placing herself more firmly between the girl and Tilbury. And when Inspector Harrow began asking questions, Miss Marple said, You grew frightened again. You knew he would recall the smuggling case sooner or later. When he looked at you at the fete, you saw realization in his eyes. Tilbury's breathing quickened. He was going to expose me. I saw it on his face. I had to act. You had the advantage of proximity, Miss Marple said, and the knowledge of a substance that causes instantaneous collapse, something not obvious in a cursory examination, something you once transported for others. Tilbury's jaw tightened. A tiny dose, barely anything. He didn't feel a thing. And Mrs. Carter? Miss Marple asked softly. Tilbury gave a short, bitter laugh. She followed me last night, saw me near the mill road where I shouldn't have been. She asked questions, clever questions. She'd have gone to the police by morning. Miss Marple lowered her voice, tender with sadness. So you struck her, cleanly, swiftly, just as someone with experience delivering heavy, precise blows, say, one accustomed to killing animals, might do. Tilbury's face twisted. You don't understand. You think anyone would have believed me if I came clean? They'd have said I killed Daniel on purpose. That I murdered Harrow. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Miss Marple did not raise her voice, but the gentle certainty within it cut sharper than accusation. It always goes far when one chooses concealment over truth. Clara stepped forward then, trembling but resolute. You robbed Daniel of a future. You robbed us of answers, and now you stand here speaking of inconvenience, of what might have happened to you. Tilbury's expression shifted from cold defensiveness to something darker. I can't let you leave, he said quietly. Any of you. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Oh, I believe you can. Tilbury blinked and froze as a sharp command rang from outside the shed. Mr. Tilbury, stand away from them, at once. Inspector Graves' voice carried with unmistakable authority. Through the crack of the door, several shadows appeared, Appleby among them. Tilbury's shoulders sagged. You led me right into it, he muttered to Miss Marple. You knew he'd follow you. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently, just as I knew you would. The door burst open. Graves and Appleby surged in, weapons drawn, and Tilbury, defeated, exhausted, made no attempt to resist as they took hold of him. Clara buried her face in her hands. Dr. Fenton sat heavily on the crate, looking as though the weight of years had fallen upon him. As Tilbury was led out, he glanced once over his shoulder at Miss Marple. If that boy hadn't tripped— Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. It was not Daniel's fall that condemned you. It was every choice you made afterward. When the shed was quiet again, Clara collapsed into Miss Marple's arms, sobbing with grief and relief intermingled, as Miss Marple stroked her hair with a tenderness born of decades of comforting the bereaved. Your brother was brave, my dear, she whispered. And now, at last, he will be found and laid to rest properly. Clara's voice broke. Thank you. Thank you for finding the truth. Miss Marple looked toward the open shed door, where the morning light now streamed unhindered. The truth, she said softly, always finds its way through the cracks, even when someone tries very hard to cover it. Outside, Inspector Graves stood waiting, the weight of the case no longer pressing forward but settling into its necessary conclusions. He looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of gratitude and awe. You were right, he said quietly. It was someone no one would suspect. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Now, respectability can be a most effective disguise." And as they stepped out into the gentle sunlight of St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor, the village, still shaken, still whispering, slowly began to wake to the truth that had been hidden in its midst for far too long. The village felt strangely hushed in the days that followed Mr. Tilbury's arrest, as though the very hedgerows and cobbled lanes were reeling from the revelation that a man so familiar, so comfortably rooted in local routine, could harbour such terrible secrets. St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor was a place accustomed to gossip, but the whisperings now were softer, chastened, touched with an unease that would linger long after the last newspaper report faded from memory. Daniel Henshaw's body, found exactly where Miss Marple said it would be, was retrieved with solemn care, and though the discovery brought grief renewed and sharp, it also brought an end to the long, uncertain waiting that had shadowed Clara's every waking hour. She moved through the village with a quiet dignity, thinner, perhaps, but steadier now, each step anchored by truth rather than hope. One afternoon, a few days after the arrests, Miss Marple sat in Adelaide Lockwood's sunny parlour with a small cup of tea balanced in her hands. Adelaide hovered nearby, fussing with the sugar bowl, though her fussing served no purpose. There had been no sugar in the bowl for hours. "I simply cannot accept it, Jane," she said for perhaps the fourth time. "Tilbury, the butcher, all these years, and not a whisper about Dorset or smuggling or whatever dreadful business he was mixed up in. Why? Mabel Prowse used to buy her sausages from him every Sunday. Now imagine feeding one's family with sausages made by a criminal." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Adelaide, wickedness does not preclude competence. I'm sure Mr. Tilbury was quite skilled in his trade." Adelaide shuddered. "Even so, it feels such a betrayal." Miss Marple nodded. "Most betrayals do, I think, particularly when they involve someone who has made themselves part of the community. People are often misled by familiarity." Adelaide plopped down across from her. "You always say that, Jane, but how on earth did you know, truly know?" Miss Marple set her teacup aside, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It was not knowledge at first," she said. "Only suspicion, built from what was not said as much as from what was." Adelaide listened, enraptured. Mrs. Carter's remark was the beginning. Not she saw Inspector Harrow recognize someone and react with alarm, but she did not see anything remarkable about the solicitor or the well-dressed stranger. And Dr. Fenton, poor man, was far too transparent in his anxieties. But the butcher, who worked quietly in the background, whose hands were strong and practiced, whose manner was always gruff but obliging, that kind of unobtrusive presence is often overlooked by those seeking more dramatic suspects. Adelaide blinked, but Mrs. Carter said nothing about him. "Precisely," Miss Marple said gently. Her silence was noticeable, and Harrow's fear suggested someone tied to his past work, someone who would not expect to encounter him at a fete. Mr. Tilbury fit perfectly. Many criminals, when creating new lives, choose professions that make them helpful, even indispensable, and it shelters them in plain sight. Adelaide shook her head, equal parts horrified and awestruck. "And you pieced all that together just from people's expressions and a few scattered remarks?" Miss Marple gave a soft, modest smile. "From many years of observing human nature, my dear." A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Adelaide bustled off to answer it, returning moments later with Clara Henshaw. Her face was still drawn with sorrow, but her eyes held a calm that had not been there before. "Miss Marple," Clara said softly, taking a seat beside her. "I wanted to thank you. Not just for finding the truth, but for finding Daniel. At least now he's at peace." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "You are very brave, my dear. Not many young women could face what you have with such composure." Clara offered a tremulous smile. "Sir Inspector Graves said the case would have gone cold without your help. He said you see things others don't." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I see things because people show them to me, whether they intend to or not. Clara hesitated. What will happen to Mr. Tilbury now? Justice will take its course, Miss Marple said. But for some of his victims, the ones he harmed long ago and Daniel most of all, the truth is the only justice that truly matters. Silence fell for a moment, not oppressive, but gentle, like a settled curtain. Then Clara leaned forward. And Dr. Fenton, he isn't being charged? No, Miss Marple said. His mistakes were moral ones, not malicious, and Inspector Harrow's notes revealed enough context to understand the full situation. He will face scrutiny, certainly, but his conscience will be clearer now. Clara nodded in quiet relief. After she departed, Adelaide let out a long theatrical sigh. You've saved the village from scandal, Jane. Imagine the newspapers. Notorious butcher crook exposed by elderly visitor. They'd have had us on the front page. I doubt I would have made for particularly exciting reading, Miss Marple said lightly, though her eyes sparkled with private amusement. Adelaide reached over and squeezed her hand. You will stay at least a few more days, won't you? I feel safer just having you near. Honestly, Jane, after this business, I shall look at every shopkeeper twice. Miss Marple laughed, a soft, warm sound. Oh, Adelaide, villages are no more wicked than the people who inhabit them, and no more innocent either. But I will remain a few days longer. It's always wise to let the dust settle before one travels. Outside, the church bells chimed the hour. The faint clatter of the milk cart echoed down the lane. Children's voices drifted from the green, already returning to play. Life, in its gentle persistence, pressed forward. And Miss Marple, seated in the sun-filled parlour with her knitting and a cooling cup of tea, reflected, as she often did, on the quiet constancy of human nature, its follies, its cruelties, its kindnesses. How easily good people could be deceived by the appearance of decency, and how often guilt hid not in shadow, but in daylight. But truth, she knew, had a way of surfacing, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a gasp, sometimes with nothing more dramatic than an elderly woman noticing a small, out-of-place detail. And in St. Aldwyn-on-the-Moor, the truth had surfaced, bringing sorrow, yes, but also clarity. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking a gentle rhythm of contentment. Another mystery resolved, another quiet village restored. And as always, she remained watchful, not out of fear, but out of understanding. For wherever people lived together, secrets bloomed like wildflowers, and Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and gentle wisdom, would always be there to tend the garden.